Okay, thank you, Barb, and thank you everyone for joining us. You may have received this RFA recently, and we're having this webinar so that people can come, they can ask questions. There are a number of unique features associated with this RFA from both a logistical and a financial perspective. And so we wanted to give the chance for everybody to ask specific questions related to their individual situations. But I'll provide a quick overview. I have about 15 to 20 slides, mostly covering the issues that we've already covered within the PDF that was distributed. But this is these RFAs are generated from a recent researcher engagement award that we received from the NIH. And so the University of Arizona banner has, for the past 5 or 6 years, been a leading recruiter for the All of Us research program. And we just recently recruited our 70,000th patient for this program. But we've also been engaged in the researcher side and actually utilizing the data within the workbench to try and make discoveries and replicate existing observations. And that's really where our focus is today, is in engaging the community, making sure everybody knows what data are available and how to utilize the data and any restrictions on the data. And then try and get people engaged, try and provide these initial funds so that we remove some of that initial roadblocks or speed bumps to actually getting on the workbench and utilizing the data. So we'll go over the logistics associated with the RFA today. Most of you should probably be familiar with what's in the workbench. This is the most recent version, the V7 Curated Data Repository. You'll see CDR V7 sometimes. But you can see that there's a wealth of data. There is a wealth of genomic data, including long-read sequences, whole genome arrays, as well as whole genome sequences. The data is really high dimensional, so you have it across multiple different domains, including survey data, genome-wide data, as well as patient-provided data. Now, the funds for this RFA are going to be coming from a recent OTA award that we were awarded at our institution. There's a number of different initiatives, two of which I'll talk about today. There is a scientific partnership that we have with the Pharmacogenomics Global Research Network, which is, you'll see some of the attributes of that. These seed grants were a part of that proposal. The purpose of these seed grants is really stimulating research, additional research within the workbench, and removing some of those initial costs associated with getting started. Now, we also have a Data Fellows program that I'll talk a little bit about later. The dates have yet to be finalized, but many of you may be interested in either applying yourselves or having your trainees or staff apply for this Fellows program as well. Now, as a seed grant awardee, all individuals will be encouraged to leverage workbench data to do a number of different things. This includes controlled tier, registered tier. Any of the data in the workbench is fair game for this announcement. Now, it does need to be focused in the workbench. I mean, that's a specific contingency for the funding of these projects. We are interested in stimulating peer-reviewed publications. I mean, I think that's one of the major focuses of our award and one of the major interests in terms of the NIH in substantiating the actual progress that we're making in terms of the researcher workbench. And another aspect of this award would be creating feedback loops with the Data and Research Center, with the NIH, to improve the resources that we have. These are early resources in terms of the cloud computing environment. And so I imagine they'll look a lot different in several years from now, and hopefully be a lot more easy to use, because there's a number of considerations right now that make the data a little bit difficult to navigate. There's actually two RFAs, and you may have received one or the other. We're expecting to fund two seed grants for Southwest regional institutions for the states that are listed here. And so if you're in one of these states and you're at an institution, it doesn't have to be academic, but if it has to have an approved DURA or DURA for all of us researcher access. And that is a condition of access to the data, and thus it is a condition of these awards as well. There's also going to be a seed grant granted for members of the Pharmacogenomics Global Research Network, and this is part of a strategic partnership that UA Banner Health has with the PGRN. There are no geographic restrictions on this RFA, and so if you're a PGRN member, it doesn't matter which state you come from. But if you're not a PGRN member and you're interested in applying for this RFA, you do need to be at an institution that comes from one of these 5 states. Now, there's a myriad of possible approaches. We listed multiple of these in the RFA. I won't go over these specifically because they're just very, very disparate in terms of the different approaches that you can take. The resource is well set up for genomic data, especially within diverse populations. The diversity is one of the main benefits of this resource above and beyond resources like the UK Biobank. And so you can perform research on health equity. You can perform research that's more discovery-based or agnostic. You can perform genomic research. Your research does not have to include genomics. And so there's really, we will accept all kinds of research as long as it's focused within the researcher workbench for all of us. So here are key dates, and we recognize first and foremost that this is a bit of a time crunch. So, sending out RFAs recently and the fact that we're asking for a January 19th submission deadline, this is an ask, especially considering that this is over the holidays. And we recognize this, and beyond apologizing for it beforehand, there's not much we can do. The way that the funding structures for our award happened, it necessitated this sort of time crunch. As a corollary, we tried to make this application as low intensity as possible. So the main portion of the application is really just a 3-page narrative discussing the feasibility of the project, the approaches that are going to be used in the project, and then the position of the individuals that are going to be carrying out the research and why they're well positioned to carry out that research. Now, to reward you for that very tight timeline in terms of application, we will be awarding these very quickly after we actually receive them. And then the award period is going to be March 1st, 2024 to August 31st, 2024. Again, we recognize that this is a fairly condensed period in terms of a grant RFA. It's 6 months. Now, because all the data are available, they're currently available on the workbench, and these projects, you may have projects or workspaces that you've already started on, and those are perfectly fine as long as they don't have other funding and you haven't substantially actually done the work that you're proposing. So we do believe a 6-month time period is a time in which you can make substantive research happen when the data are already currently available. And the $40,000 award should be able to catalyze quite a bit of research, considering that really these RFAs only cover personnel expenses and computational and data storage expenses. Please note that $40,000 is inclusive of indirect costs. There's just really no way that we can get this money out, which is it originates from the NIH, and there's no way we can get the money out without adding indirect costs inclusive of that $40,000 award amount. So depending on what your indirect rate is for the NIH, which presumably has already been negotiated for your institution, that will come off of that $40,000 fixed sum. Now, I did say the award period was up to 6 months, but please note that we are hoping to be able to allow no-cost extensions for these awards, to give investigators a greater time period to actually come to to a deliverable such as a publication and to really finish up their research because it's going to be a challenge to do these, within a 6-month time period. However, those extensions are going to be entirely contingent on the extension of our award that we received, so the parent award. Because we haven't been granted one and because it's not a guarantee at this point, we also can't guarantee an extension. But if we are granted an extension from the NIH, we do plan to extend these awards if necessary and justifiable. You can see here the contact information. I'll show this a couple of times. You don't have to worry about multiple submissions per institution, and because we will allow them, and there are multi-PI applications allowed, so long as all the PIs come from an institution that has an active DURA, or in the case of the Southwest Regional RFA, are from institutions that are from those states. So if we go through the eligibility, I've reviewed most of this up to this point. Again, your institution needs to have an active DURA. That's a prerequisite for all of us access. We definitely want to encourage individuals from diverse backgrounds, including underrepresented backgrounds from biomedical research, to submit to this RFA. And then you can see the review criteria here. And that is, I won't read these line by line. These are all in the RFA, and they're repeated verbatim here. Feasibility is one thing that I want to mention specifically. Feasibility is something that we have found in our seed grants that we've offered intramurally can be difficult to assess and can certainly make the project difficult to complete. And so going into the public data browser portion or into the actual data to assess the numbers and the feasibility from a computational perspective and a cost perspective of the analyses that you're proposing will be important. And just showing evidence that the investigators have looked and have identified their phenotypes, either from the electronic health record data or whatever data are appropriate, that they've identified some of the sample size requirements for the statistical approaches that they're taking, and that that those sample sizes are consistent with ability to make generalizable statements at the end of the research. So as you're probably aware, the cloud computing environment in all of us is unique in that it is the only way to access all of us data. In prior data sets, such as the UK Biobank, you download, you analyze on your local servers. All of us is very different. There's a DRC server that is hosted by Google Cloud Compute and the Data and Research Center at Vanderbilt University. This provides both benefits and challenges. It sort of equals the playing field, but at the same time, any pipelines that you've developed in your home institution, in other cloud computing environments, may or may not work within the All of Us researcher workbench. And so this does provide additional security, but it also has created issues in terms of analyzing the data, having to take an iterative approach to make sure that your pipelines actually work and are giving you what you expect. And so this is a major consideration in terms of actually accessing the data here, and one of the major differences between the way virtually all other biobanks work and how All of Us works. So we've been working on this for quite some time. We have multiple seed grants that we've awarded. We've also had driver projects that were more recently awarded. These are similar funding mechanisms to the RFA that we're announcing today. And really, our initiatives have led to a conclusion that one of the rate limiting steps is the lack of informatics skills and expertise. So the workbench is unique. The cloud computing environment is unique, and it can be finicky. or glitchy at times. So one of the things that we thought was important was to provide additional biomedical analyst expertise in FTEs. So each of these seed grants that are awarded will get, if they want to take advantage of a quarter of a person for that 6-month time period, um, an individual from our biomedical informatics core that has researcher workbench experience that can help with the R and Python coding, some of the unique cloud computing considerations, and help with data access as well. Now, that wouldn't be included in the budget. You would not include that in the budget that you submit. That is in-kind support. In terms of the use of these funds, please note that these are going to be subcontracts off of a parent NIH grant here. And so it will take some processing time. If you are coming from multiple institutions with a multiple PI grant, there's going to be additional processing times likely based on multiple subcontracts between different institutions. And that, again, funds originate from the NIH, and so we need to use NIH-specific indirect cost rates. Unless you can acquire an exemption, in which case you can submit evidence of that exemption with your application, and then represent the budget as is appropriate. In terms of allowable costs, this is mostly going to be your indirects, efforts, and then computational and data storage costs. You don't need to include any of this core support that I just mentioned, but there really aren't going to be many allowable costs outside of that purview. Consumable research supplies, experimental reagents, equipment, those are all not permitted. Similarly, we're not allowing graduate tuition remission or international travel costs given the very short time frame of the actual RFA. Similarly, peer review publication or open access fees aren't allowable, and so this is really going to be focused on efforts for the individual people, including the PIs, and then the computational and data storage costs. And we can point any investigators to estimates for those data storage and computational costs. But I will preface this by saying sometimes it can be difficult to anticipate what those costs will be on a project-specific basis. In terms of the actual submission, and again, this is all mentioned in the RFA, there is a cover sheet that doesn't count against the page limit. That includes an abstract that could be understandable to a scientifically or technically literate lay reader. Then we have a 3-page proposal narrative, which is going to be the primary piece that is that's reviewed based on the criteria I showed earlier. This includes, of course, your specific aims or objectives, the significance and expected outcomes, and then the methodology and description of how the research will be carried out. And then we asked for a brief description as to why the PI and key personnel are qualified to conduct the study. And also, again, this assessment of feasibility will be important here to include in the proposal narrative. There's also a number of supplemental documents, including CVs or bio sketches, and then the budget and reference cited portions. So we're trying to make this fairly easy and fairly low amount of work in order to submit this to this RFA and turn it around by January 19th. I've mentioned feasibility several times. Just to reiterate that, this is the URL for the data browser. You can go on here. You can look at minor allele frequencies for single nucleotide polymorphisms. You can look at number of respondents for given surveys. You can look at incidences of specific EHR codes and view those by race and ethnicity. So there is quite a bit that you can do on this public data browser, and this is very easy to navigate. And this is very useful, I'd say, from a grant feasibility standpoint. Much harder to get into the workbench and actually get this data on a row level basis. But that is also completely acceptable if you want to use the workbench to actually provide feasibility in terms of sample size or in terms of availability of the data points that you're going to be using. Here's an example budget. Again, this is very simple. You know, this is salaries and EREs, efforts over this 6-month period, and then computing time and for the workbench as well as cloud storage, and then an indirect rate. So here in this example, we've used a 52% indirect rate, and that came off of the 40,000, giving a subtotal for labor and expenses here. And again, this is a fairly simple approach, and we can provide additional information for estimated rates for Google Compute Engine machine costs as well as storage costs as well. In terms of reporting requirements, there will be an attestation of compliance with data security and participant data privacy measures. So this is required as part of your access to the workbench in the first place. But the PIs don't always, they're not always the ones that are working on the workbench specifically, don't always have access to. So we will ask for an additional attestation prior to the award. That's really consistent with the programmatic attestation. So you're not going to download row level data onto local drives. You're not going to try to re-identify individual participants. That's, again, prohibited by the DURAs within all of us. And then stigmatizing research, especially as it relates to racial and ethnic minorities, is also prohibited in terms of interpretation of findings and analysis of the study. Eventually, we'll require a 2-page report. And then we do ask that awardees participate in a monthly community building meeting. And we've had these, and we call them workbench community forums. We've had these in prior years for our other awardees. They're primarily from the institution. But this is an opportunity to share with other PIs and other awardees some of the issues that have been encountered, some of the suggestions for improvement of the workbench and the associated infrastructure, and also just to sort of build a community around this actual workbench research. So again, here's your contacts. Feel free to contact me with specific questions. If you have questions around the research topic, if you have questions around what piece of the research that I'm currently working on would be appropriate for the RFA, I'm happy to answer any of these questions, and I've answered several up to this point. If I can't answer it, we'll refer you to the right person. There's another number of other resources that you might want to engage in. There's a research roundup, which is freely available to non-consortium members. You can see the sign up here. You can get indications of how much research is going on, what the recent publications within the workbench are, and start to be part of that community. There is also a support hub associated with the workbench. There is no login required for this. You can find instructional materials, you can search articles, you can see what research has already been done. There's also workspace, the workspace descriptions. You can see what research is being done by other groups. You can potentially contact those PIs. You can create a more collaborative environment from that perspective. I told you I'd mention this. This is our Data Fellows program, which is going to start during that same time period as the RFAs for these grants. We're planning a submission deadline for January 31st, but this would be open to graduate students, postdocs, and junior faculty. And we would give priority to Southwest U.S. states. We'd also give a $2,000 stipend. This is expected to take about a quarter of these fellows' time during that 6-month period. And this would be mostly virtual courses, really directed at the workbench specifically. Trying to get people with the necessary skills to actually use the workbench to perform analyses, showing them where data is held, how to navigate the cloud computing environment. And these individuals would also complete research projects in the workbench, original research projects, and then be mentored by established research scientists within U of A and elsewhere. And so with that, I'll open it up to any questions and see what inquiries everybody has. I'm going to open up the chat. Okay, I don't see any relevant questions in the chat, so happy to take them verbally, or feel free to post them in the chat if that's more convenient.
Hi, Jason. This is Sukwa from UCSF. Thanks for inviting the PGIN group. I just have a quick question regarding to the budget for the 40K. Let's say, for example, I planning to run analysis and will take up a huge chunk of the computational time. But of course, getting a real estimate of the cost can be a problem. Let's say I requested $10,000 just for computational use in the all of us. And once I got the money from you, and I will just put it into the all of us for $10,000. And maybe I will not use it up for the 6 months period, but it may be like 1 year. Is that okay? Or like I'm just not sure if I put the money in all of us, I have to use it up within that 6 months that you mentioned.
Logistically, we would have to, I think, have a further discussion about how that would work. I mean, technically, from the NIH's standpoint, the funds would need to be expended before August 31st. Now you could, we could create a subcontract and potentially extend that if we received a no-cost extension. But I wouldn't plan on sort of, creating a lump sum of funds that could be used in perpetuity, right? So the subcontracts are going to have monthly assessments and charges, and so it's really going to be continuously monitored. So I think the arrangement that you mentioned, probably we wouldn't be able to do that. Now, that being said, if there's a larger proportion of your budget that's going to go through to computational costs, like say, you have this fundamental problem, you need to spend $20,000 to load all the VCFs from the whole genome sequencing and run, I don't know, Stargazer for pharmacogenomic alleles, right? Which you shouldn't do because it's being done right now by the DRC. But anyway, just as an example, those kinds of lump sum, workbench costs would totally be allowable under the auspices of the RFA.
Okay, I see. Okay, all right, thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Sometimes I just don't know. I'm using the NIH funding for another project, so I put some small number of money in there just in case I run out. So I always put it in there. But technically I'm not sure how the money comes around. The money just reviews slowly, but I already put the NIH fund in there. So when the fund run out next year for my NIH grant, I'm not sure what happened to that money if I haven't used it, even though it's just a few $100 on it. So I thought maybe the money's in there, even though I don't use it up, it can go on forever.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, again, we could have, a more detailed discussion about this, but officially, yeah, the funds need to be expunged they need to be exhausted by the time period, or else we have to talk about maybe recouping those funds, just based on a regulatory subcontract sort of perspective.
I see. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Sure. I see there's some other questions in the chat. So should a CV be provided for a student? And the answer to that is only if that student is considered key personnel on the project. So we're asking for CVs and resumes for key personnel, just as an NIH grant would. If you want to put additional staff or students on your grant, that is absolutely fine, but you don't need to submit CVs unless you're considering them, a key piece of the grant and a key personnel on the grant. And then how does one work with the 0.25 analyst? Is there a fixed schedule? That is something that we haven't we haven't set in stone, right? So I think that this would be based on what works best in terms of your team. So we have an allocated amount of time. If this is regular check-in meetings for 30 minutes, and then the rest of the analyst time is spent on optimizing R code or Python code, then that works fine too. But it'll be largely up to the investigators in terms of how they want to spend that time. So I think there's a large amount of flexibility in terms of the 0.25 analyst. Um, in terms of a fixed schedule, like if you wanted to use all of that analyst effort up within a month-long time frame, as opposed to that 6-month time frame, then we would probably need to have a discussion around, the other sort of responsibilities for those individual analysts and whether that would be possible, but certainly willing to have a conversation around that. We haven't really put structured elements around that FTE besides just assigning that FTE per particular individual. Another question: as a junior faculty, could one and the same person apply for both the fellowship and as a PI as a project? And the answer is absolutely. So the Data Fellows program is going to be independent. And so if you wanted to do both, you would certainly be able to apply for both. Similarly, if you have staff or investigator or junior faculty or postdocs that are in your lab that want to do this, and maybe their effort is also associated with this project, I see that as synergy as opposed to overlap, right? So these are independent projects, and you could do that as well. Okay, what budget variances are allowed among the categories for the 40K budget? Right, and so this I think gets to the response to Sukwa's question around does a certain proportion of the budget have to be personnel and a certain proportion data and computational costs? And we have not put any restrictions there. And so it'll be up to our study section in terms of their review and whether this aligns with the review criteria that I mentioned. But you could hypothetically have no personnel support on your grant line items whatsoever. You could allocate all of that money. You could allocate all of that money towards computational costs if you thought that was appropriate and that was going to help you reach your programmatic goals faster. In terms of changing the allocation after it's awarded, so again, these would be subcontracts. So we will establish an initial subcontract with an updated budget at the time of the award, but those can be changed. So we don't have grant-related restrictions in terms of how that money can be spent besides, the allowable and not allowable costs. So if those needed to be adjusted during the award period, then they could easily be adjusted just through a subcontract amendment process. Those are all the questions I have from the chat. I will stay
So
on for the next. Oh, go
one
ahead.
question. So since the student tuition cannot be paid, so then students probably have to be paid hourly, right?
Would you say that again?
So it is said that the students' tuition cannot be paid, so then the students can only paid by hourly, right?
So the graduate tuition remission can't be paid. So in other words, tuition is not an allowable cost. But from a graduate student perspective, I don't see why you couldn't use a percent of effort or an hourly wage. Both of those, in my mind, would be acceptable unless I'm missing something.
Okay. UFA, at least if we put a percentage of FTE, then we have to pay tuition. But if we pay hourly, then it should be fine.
Okay.
Or paid in summer, because summer actually does not have any tuition.
So yeah, no, let me follow up for intra-institutional applications for this RFA. You may well be right, and it's may have been an aspect that we missed, but let me follow up on that because I think this is something that probably affects only U of A people. But another question, do you need an amendment if under 25% variance? So again, if the this is sort of like related to the NIH, you know, the PI's purview having 25% reallocation. We haven't put any variance restrictions on this. And so from my perspective, we're going to be very flexible in terms of if you have justifiable changes to your line items for budget, like personnel versus computational costs, if you want to vary those more than 25%, we don't have restrictions on that. So, you know, you create a budget based on your anticipated costs. If there are unanticipated costs or the reallocation needs to happen in a way that you didn't anticipate, then we can work with your group to facilitate that. But there's not going to be a variance restriction in terms of reallocation across the different line items.